Hello, everyone. I'm Susan Sandahl, and it's my pleasure to welcome you tonight on behalf of the College of Education and the National Center on Quality Teaching and Learning. Our speaker this evening is Dr. Linda Espinosa, and here's the most important thing you need to know about Linda. She's a Husky. So she got her bachelor's degree from the University of Washington, and so we're proud to call her an alum. She went on to get her additional credentials and degrees and has had a really very strong and influential career in early childhood education. She's retired from the faculty at the University of Missouri in Columbia, but you would not notice it because she is so busy. She's an active researcher. She works on policy. She is asked to speak all the time by people like us and lots of other people across the country. She continues to write and produce some really important things. I think she'll refer to her most recent book. And she has a number of other articles and chapters that I use in my class. The one that's handed out tonight is something that I've used in a class, so I hope you get a chance to read that. She has been an active member of NAAPE, so she's just really important to our field, and we are delighted that she's here this evening, and her talk will be on designing effective instruction for young children from diverse backgrounds, what works and why. Here we go.
Good evening, and it really truly is my pleasure to be here tonight because as Susan said, I am a Husky in more ways than one, unfortunately over the years, but I was born in West Seattle. I graduated from high school in Burien. I went to the University of Washington and graduated. I was actually the first cohort of Teacher Corps members, and in those days they were recruiting undergraduates to prepare you to teach in inner cities. And my very first teaching job was at Leschi Elementary School, and this was before desegregation, you can imagine. So, and I won't tell you the years when all this happened, but some of them started with a 7, so there you go. And as Susan said, that I am officially, supposed to be retired, but as my husband says, it's retired without the re. Honey, you're just tired, So, and what a privilege. I mean, I'd have to say, what a privilege and what an honor to come back to my alma mater and to be able to speak to you all and to continue to work. I mean, to some extent, I've been freed up from advisory committees. and I can really work on the topics with the people on the projects, including this one and many of the things that you all are involved with here at the University of Washington, to really try to affect and change policy and practice in the direction that I've worked for over 30 years to really try to uncover and understand for myself. So I just say that, as a way of affirming my roots in this particular area in Seattle. And the other thing that I think is so great is I don't mind the weather here. I don't particularly like a lot of sunshine, so I'm comfortable and happy here. So I'm going to talk about effective instruction for children from diverse backgrounds. And I wanted to start with a quote that kind of sets the tone for what I'm going to be describing tonight. As the global economy becomes more competitive and interdependent, we will more than ever need the talents of all our people. Our challenge will be to create social institutions that value and benefit from racial, cultural, and linguistic diversity while at the same time guaranteeing opportunities for all. And that was written in 1990. There are other quotes that we can find that affirm the value and the benefit of diversity. So for a long time, I think we've understood that this is our future, and we had better design. Now, they call it social institutions. We can call it educational institutions. We can call it family settings, whatever, that allows these talents to be developed and contribute to the betterment of both them, their family, and society writ large. Let me also say one more thing before I get too far along. I was at the iLabs today with Gina, and I told her that I was from Seattle, and she said, "Oh, no, you can't be from Seattle." I said, "Well, why not?" She said, "You talk too fast." That I have a tendency to talk very rapidly, and so she thought I was from the East Coast. People have actually made that assumption about me because I have spent a lot of time on the East Coast. I talk rapidly, and if I am being confusing or unclear or whatever, feel free to raise your hand and stop me and ask me to clarify it. It doesn't bother me at all. Also, if I mention some studies or some reports or something and you want to follow up, my email address is on the first slide. You can send me an email afterwards, and I'd be happy to send you reams and reams of papers that I just have laying around. So don't feel inhibited about stopping me if you need some clarification or if you're not understanding what I'm saying. You know, one of the real benefits of growing older is you accept who you are. You know, I'm not denying that I'm short anymore or that I talk rapidly. I used to really object to certain things people would say, but it doesn't bother me at all. And it doesn't bother me when you have, you know, problems around that. So stop me, it's okay. So who is diverse? Who do we think of when we talk about diversity? In this country, for children, it's children of color, African American, Latino, Native American typically are who we're talking about when we talk about diverse populations. Children of immigrants, children who come from language minority backgrounds, in other words, they don't speak English in the home, and children from poor or low socioeconomic status are often included in that term diversity. Diversity typically means different. In educational usage, diversity often means different from mainstream Anglo middle-class population. So you have kind of a strand, a basis for comparison, and that's typically middle-class Anglo-American values, standards, records, et cetera. And that's who children from diverse backgrounds are often compared to. For Washington State and the United States, diversity is increasingly the norm. It's 21st century. Many languages, many cultures, many races, much economic diversity. And this statistic actually just came out this week. In 2011, minority births, that's Hispanics, blacks, Asians, and mixed races, exceeded those of non-Hispanic whites. So for the very first time in this country, and it might actually help us to move away from this talking minority-majority. In California, that's not true anymore. The majority culture is Hispanic and speaks Spanish. You know? So these terms that have hung around in our educational vocabulary, we're going to have to rethink them going further into the 21st century. So in 2011, non-Hispanic whites were 49.6, less than 50% of the births, and 50.4% were from minority populations. And I was looking up some things for Washington State, knowing that I was coming here. So I wanted to show you this statistic as well. So for the Washington State population growth among K-12 students, 1986 to 2008, and these are the percentage growth during that time period. The white population growth has been 5.9%, African American 92.1%, American Indian 51.9%, Asian Pacific Islander 134%, Latino almost 372%. Percentage growth. It's still not, you're still not close to California, but it is the most rapidly growing proportion of your population, yeah. Uh-huh.
Does African American include Africans?
Okay, so what you're referring to would be families who were born in Africa and come to this country as immigrants, but they are Africans. Okay, that term is typically used for people who are here long-term seeking resident status or something like that. So they would be African American or black, but if they are African nationality, and that's what they maintain, they would be African, you know, not African American. You know, so, and all of these terms are shaded. So the rigid boundaries, you know, like on the census, they now have a mixed race, ethnicity category, et cetera. So we're really moving into a much more fluid, much more overlapping definitions of ethnicities and race and whatnot. So I got that from your OSPI. So growing diversity means growing challenges. And absolutely, and before we get finished tonight, you will see the opportunities, particularly for those of you who are beginning your careers. It couldn't be a more exciting time for your professional growth and development and what you are setting out to do for the children and families that you serve. However, I have to look at the past a little bit before I can move on to the optimistic future. So typically, children from diverse backgrounds historically have been underserved or inappropriate served populations. And some of the indicators of that would be the attendance participation rates. If you look at the extent to which they participate in organized preschool early educational experiences and whatnot. And there are lots of reasons for that. I don't have time to go into all of that tonight, but they tend not to attend at the same rates. Achievement patterns, if you just look across from kindergarten entry, third grade reading, math scores, high school completion, college matriculation, college completion, any of those things, you're going to find huge gaps between children from those diverse populations and what we think of as non-minority middle class. If you look at adult incomes and percent in poverty, same thing. And I think I have, oh, I do. I have a little bit from Washington State. So children from low-income and diverse families, highly vulnerable to underachievement in our educational schools right now, educational institutions. If you look at the achievement gaps at kindergarten entry, the NAAPE score, does everybody know what NAAPE is? No, okay. Good, you stopped me, or I stopped myself. I can learn self-regulation, it's not too late. But, okay, so NAAPE stands for the National Assessment of Educational Progress, National Assessment of Educational Progress. It's a national one-shot snapshot of how children are performing in 4th grade and 8th grade and I think 10th grade and 11th grade or something. And so you have representative samples at the beginning of 4th grade and how they're doing in reading, language arts, and then in math. So it's a fairly broad, but it's a profile that is used by policymakers to say, how is this country doing compared to 5 years ago, compared to 10 years ago? How is it doing compared to where we want to go? So if you look at the NAAPE scores, and I'm going to show those to you in a minute, or Washington State, if you look at your Washington State achievement data, I was actually surprised. I was surprised at the achievement gaps between Latinos, between English language learners, and children who are classified as white, monolingual English speaking. 20 to 40 points. Huge. Pardon me?
20 points out of
20 to 40 points in terms of, for instance, if it's a scale of, well, and I'm going to show some of the graphs on that. If it's a scale that says 100% are achieving mastery in language arts at 4th grade, and let's say 80% of white native English speakers, then it could be as low as 60 or 40%. I mean, there are huge gaps for the state of Washington. And there are some reports that just have been documenting that. I think, again, to raise the attention and the focus on this population. So again, I mean, so what you're doing tonight, what you guys are doing in your centers, so that we can start to adapt and adjust these educational experiences that they have. And before tonight's over, you're going to know exactly my point of view about how to do that too. So children identified as significantly behind at kindergarten entry. Children living in poverty, I'll show you the data on that. Children from minority backgrounds and children from non-English speaking homes. And again, we know this from, does everybody here know what the early childhood longitudinal study is? Kindergarten cohort. If you don't, just raise your hand so I'll explain it. But if you do, I don't want, okay. Again, this is a national sample of over 20,000 children, what I call it the Eccles K, but they started kindergarten in 1998-99, and these children have been tracked over time. So we have data about how they looked in 1st grade, 2nd grade, 3rd grade, and now many of them have actually already graduated from high school. So the children's performance, the teachers are interviewed, and the families are interviewed as well. So we get some sort of a picture of how different groups of children navigate their way through our educational institution. There's a fairly newer study called the Eccles B, Early Childhood Longitudinal Study, birth cohort. And these children are being followed from birth. It's a smaller sample, like around 12,000 students or something. And they were born in 2001, right? So they're not quite coming of age, but they're younger. And the data that we're deriving from that sample is actually much more comprehensive. So we can see what's happening in the homes and talk with the families and observe their development, which is very important for us who look at dual language development, because we can see how that native language experience contributes to English acquisition, et cetera. So anyway, that's a huge data set that we've been able to derive some understanding of what's happening developmentally and educationally with these children. Can you see the figures on that? Okay, I just want to point out a few things. This is the NAAPE. These are the NAAPE scores from 2009. And again, remember, it's fourth grade, at the beginning of fourth grade. So the percent of fourth graders scoring below proficient and below basic on NAAPE reading tests by family, income, and race ethnicity, 2009. So if you look to the left of the line, it's below proficient. And for NAAPE, proficient at fourth grade is pretty high. That's a pretty high standard. You can think of that as being like an A grade. These students know how to read material, complex content, make inferences, understand what the author's intent was, whether it's a biased presentation, et cetera. It's a pretty sophisticated expectation. Below basic would be they can't read the literal interpretation of the print that's on the page. So they're having difficulty, and if below basic would mean that if it doesn't improve at some level, they could have trouble, for instance, reading the directions on the prescription bottle. Basic things like that, reading the newspaper, et cetera. That level of comprehension is not there. So if you look at this, and let's just go down, all students below proficient, 67%. That's still concerning. But then if you look at white, 58%, black, 84%, Hispanic, 83%, Asian, Pacific Islander, 51%, and American Indian. Now, if you look at below proficient, the next column there is low-income students. Low-income black students, 89% are not proficient. 89% of black children who are qualified for free and reduced lunch are not proficient in English language arts, 89%. And for Hispanic, it's 87%. These are untenable. They're untenable for a society. If you look at below basic, again, same thing. The middle column is low-income students. So if you look at black, it's 58, Hispanic, 56, American Indian, 59. This report actually generated quite a bit of policy work. People and they call it Campaign for Grade Level Reading, at the federal level, at lots of foundations, et cetera, are really trying to organize behind, okay, they're not achieving at fourth grade. And if children don't read by fourth grade, they're probably not going to make that up. That's a sign of distress for even finishing high school. So what do we do? So up to half the gap in achievement scores in school can be attributed to gaps already evident at the time of kindergarten entry. So what we know is that a lot of what happens that shows up at kindergarten entry and then third grade happens during those birth to 5, those preschool years. And the factors that contribute to readiness for school success, genetics, clearly. Every single one of us in this room has a genetic or biological endowment that we're born with, and the importance of that we're finding out more and more. The environment and experiences, but genetics isn't everything. And part of what's fascinating in some of this biological research is showing how genes can be turned on or off by the environmental context that young children are growing up with. Both diseases, talents, you're not just born with certain things and they develop, they mature over time regardless of what happens to you. It's those experiences, and that's what we do. That's what we do that contributes to the life trajectory of these children, is we provide those experiences that allows that biological endowment to express itself and to accomplish these feats that we have identified as important and necessary for both school and life success. So, and I put this on here because I wanted you all to be aware of a resource for you going forward. A healthy and stimulating experience results in brain architecture that operates at its full genetic potential, and persistent adversity leads to weak brain architecture with impaired capabilities. Do any of you know about the National Scientific Council on the Developing Child at Harvard? Well, you don't count. If you didn't know about it, I would be a little concerned. No, I'm kidding. You do count. But if you ever have a chance, this is a center at Harvard that's headed up by an MD, a physician, Jack Shonkoff. And what they do is they translate very complicated medical findings around neuroscience, around biology, around a whole variety of related medical fields. They translate that research into lay language so that it can be used to present to our senators, our representatives, so it can be used to do their policy work up on the Hill. So the reason I'm telling you that is that I think that as you progress and start to dig into some of these things a little bit more deeply, that is a website, if you just Google it and go to the website, that you're going to find papers similar to my policy brief that you got today, but much better, I mean, really, and it's dominated by and headed by physicians and hard science leaders in the country who spend the majority of their time advocating for children and families in this country. When I was in school, like you guys, we had nothing like that. People still really viewed what we did with little children as, oh, isn't that nice? You know? But it's not a career. Actually, my family used to say that. Oh, that's so sweet, but that's really not something you can make your living at. So one of the things, and this is in one of their reports, is that they've helped us understand as a field what happens to an infant, a toddler, a preschooler when they have chronic exposure to what they call toxic stress. And that can be everything from nobody's talking to a baby, nobody's looking at the baby, nobody's developing that positive attachment, to child abuse, to poor nutrition, to lack of educational language interaction exposure, et cetera. It can be anything. But they've actually been able to show how that compromises neural development, the dendrites, or the connectivity of the cells to each other to allow for growth and development. So from my point of view, it's helped us understand the role of education as it contributes to maturation to achieve these developmental milestones. So these things are all woven up together. If one doesn't happen, these kids are not going to naturally, spontaneously, instinctively learn language. It happens as a result of interactions with some kids, hopefully most kids, that's just part of their environment. So the basic concepts of neuroscience and child development research indicate that early environments that do not provide such growth-promoting experiences beginning in early infancy miss out on key windows of opportunity for building healthy brain architecture and mastering important foundational skills that are building blocks for increasingly complex brain circuits and capacities over time. So this is new. When I was in school like you, we did not know this. We did not have MDs that were helping us. We had little kids to watch who were sucking on pacifiers, and you didn't know what was going on. Actually, this is great. When I was an undergraduate here at the University of Washington, I worked at the Experimental Education Unit. Do you guys know what that is? Yes, okay. Okay, so I worked there as an undergraduate in the integrated classroom under K. Eileen Allen. And you took seminars along with your coursework and working in the classrooms. And at that time, behaviorism was huge. Ivar Lovaas's stuff, and we were working with children from moderate to more involved delays. And we talked about what was going on inside the child, you know, in terms of the feeling, the cognitive consequences of some of what we were doing, because we were really, truly, pretty explicitly and overtly managing the environment through positive reinforcement, okay, including M&Ms, I mean, things like that. So, and you know, I was 20 years old. What do you know when you're 20? But I remember saying to K. Eileen Allen, but what's going on inside the child? You know, isn't that, because you know as a human being, there is something more than just the eye gaze. And K. Eileen Allen said to me at that time, it's the black box, Linda. Nobody knows what happens inside the black box. All we can go on is what we see the child do. Okay, sort of our behavioral correlates of learning and achievement. Now, thanks to, I think, a lot of what's going on in the iLabs and other neuroscience labs, we do have a window into what's going on in the brain. And we do know that what's happening during that first year of life is extremely active and significant for what happens later during language development and whatnot. We did not know this 30 years ago. So all of you here, what is going to seem obvious and common sense, believe me, it's sitting on 30 years of very hard work of people like Patricia Kuhl, the special ed people, other people that have been steadily and slowly kind of making contributions that chip away at this idea that they're just babies, that nothing's going on with them. Not true. And before I get on and forget this little tiny point, I'm going to show you a video of Patricia Kuhl in just a minute, but she recently did something for NBC News, and at the end of it, she showed a video about how the brain, when it's stimulated in different areas of the brain, and that all allows the child to perceive and produce language and to communicate and interact. And at the very end of it, she said that if you're talking with a baby or you're working with a young child, and somebody comes up and they think that that's not very important and they interrupt you, that what you're to say is that I'm making a brain. We could not have said that 30 years ago, and it really helps that she's an MD, I have to say, because sometimes, for whatever reason. All right, so we know that poverty has deleterious effects, and poverty in and of itself, the financial stresses seem to have correlates with language and learning opportunities that children have. So it is highly associated with negative language development. So what we do during pre-K will have long-term benefits for children. Okay, now I'm going to switch to, that was sort of general, and I didn't have a chance to talk about resiliency and everything, or you would be here all night. That's not a good thing for you. But I want to talk about dual language learners. And what do we know specifically about how to promote their language development and their school achievement in English? So one of the things that we know is that language, any language, is the foundation for literacy. So language, in any language, okay. And literacy in English is critical for school success here. And I'd like to start with that because I never want anybody to be confused about what my long-term ultimate goals are. Every child in this country who attends our schools has to become highly proficient in English. Absolutely, no doubt about it. I've always believed that the key to a middle-class life in this country is being eligible to enter higher education like you all have been able to do. They don't give the SAT or the ACT in anything but English, and it's a complex language task. So we share that goal. I will never say that a child can function in this society if they haven't become highly proficient in English, and that we need these strong reading skills. But the question becomes, and when you saw those achievement gaps, obviously we need to do something a little differently because these children are not achieving in English. So how do we accomplish this goal when children already have a language and that language is not English? First thing we have to do is understand dual language development. So what do we know about that? The next question that I ask is, how much of achievement gap is due to language status, the fact that a child has a language other than English in the home, versus the fact that the child is probably highly probable to be living in a low SES home, versus they maybe have not had, remember we talked about attendance, they have not had the opportunity to participate in an organized early educational setting. So this is a huge point. I actually want everybody, to be able to disentangle this as you think about dual language development. Because a lot of the reports that you will see, a lot of reports that come out that I read at the federal level, at the state levels, will make conclusions about the fact that a child has a second language without pulling out the effect of poverty or other conditions. People at the federal level, never mind, this is being taped. I'm not going to say anything else. Do itself. And that's really hard for me, you know, because I'm just a big blubber. But okay, so what we have found is that the outcomes, achievement levels for children who are dual language learners are related to both which language is spoken in the home and the SES level of the family. So, and what we did was we took that Eccles-K early childhood longitudinal study and we disaggregated it by SES and by language spoken. So let me just pose this to you right now. The Eccles-K data set, again, 22,000 children at 5 years of age, assessed in their kindergarten readiness in language arts and math. 4 language groups. One was monolingual English, they spoke English, they were proficient in English. One was Spanish speaking, they came from homes that spoke Spanish. One was children, and they classified them as children coming from a European speaking home, which could have been German, Bosnian, French, any variety of a European language, but not Spanish. And then the 4th group was children coming from an Asian-speaking home. So it could have been Chinese, Korean, Pakistani, Indian, etc. So these 4 language groups, okay? And so when they started kindergarten, they were assessed. If you had to guess which language group, no, actually, let me ask you this question a little bit differently. If you, and everybody was compared against the native English speakers, the monolingual English-speaking children. That was kind of the reference group when we did this study. Okay. If you had to guess children who came from an Asian-speaking family, okay, their home language, let's say, was Mandarin. They're assessed at kindergarten entry in English. What would you say? Pardon me? They did the best. And why do you say that?
Because their cultural thing is about learning, and achievement is very important to the Chinese. It's kind of like, I don't, sorry for my language, but I'm not an native English speaker, but they do learn in their cultural thing is learning is very important, and they dedicate themselves more than doing other stuff.
So there are cultural influences that we would predict would lead these children to be very high achievers. And actually, if it doesn't take a whole lot to pick up your newspaper and look at who are the valedictorians across the country. Or I just watched the Geography Bee from National Geographic, and there were 12 finalists, I think, and there was only 1 native English speaker in that group. They're high, we have historically high, and that's sort of a perception that we have, that families encourage children to excel at education, and that might explain it. In fact, if you looked at the Asian-speaking group as a whole, when they entered kindergarten, they scored below monolingual English speakers. They scored below on those kindergarten entry. By 3rd grade, they exceeded at math and at English language arts. So it does sort of affirm some of that cultural explanation. But they had a language other than English in the home. They started out looking behind. By 3rd grade, they're looking great. So it makes you wonder, oh, what's this language hypothesis then? What about children from European-speaking groups? Okay, they come to this country, they speak a European language. Where would you think that they would score compared to monolingual? Pardon me? Just shout it out. It's okay. A little bit lower? Okay. Pardon me?
A little lower than Asian.
A little lower than Asian? Okay. That's a good guess.
The Russian also have the willing to succeed and achieve.
So high aspirations, encouraging high achievement from families and whatnot, from European-speaking families. Any other, does anybody else have any? What would you think, Gail?
I couldn't answer.
No, I told you didn't count, but well, I still want to hear from you, But if you think about that for a minute, okay. Actually, children who come from families that speak a European language at kindergarten entry score higher than Asian, than monolingual English-speaking kids at every testing point, because we pulled that language group out. they're ELL or DLL, but they have this particular language group, and they score higher at every single assessment period. Now, we'll keep that in our mind for a minute and to think about how we might explain that. Okay, let's think about Spanish-speaking kids now. They come from a Spanish-speaking home. How would you think they compare at kindergarten entry? Lower. I mean, yeah, and that's like 80% of our children who are identified as DLL or ELL. They score lower at kindergarten entry, and they don't make it up, okay? Now, I want to go into this a little bit more because it helps to explain what we saw. Okay, if you look at this table 5, from a report we did. So what we did was we pulled apart language spoken in the home from SES. And if you'll look at this percent of language minority households by SES, you have English-speaking, monolingual native English speakers, Spanish-speaking, European-speaking, and Asian-speaking. And the first column here, the first quintile would be families that would be in the lowest SES level. In other words, the income levels, probably the children qualify for free and reduced lunch. Second quintile would probably be the working poor, all the way up to fifth quintile, which I'm not sure if anyone in this room, right, it's not quite the top 1%, but you know, these are families that have means. Okay, so if you look at the English-speaking group and just go down that, you know, from 13, 19, 21, 23, 24, what does it look like to you? The distribution. English-speaking families in terms of income. Pardon me?
I said fairly even, but skewed towards the highest.
Okay, so if you just look at, these are English-speaking families, and 13% of the English-speaking families are in the bottom quintile for income in SES. So they're very low income. Actually, you know what? This was children who entered kindergarten in 1998-99. That figure is almost up to 20% now. I mean, because of the recession and other things, many more children and families are in poverty. But nevertheless, these were the data that we had. So if you look at that, so 24% of English-speaking children in this national data set were in the top quintile, okay? So if you look at Spanish-speaking, what do you see? If you just go down. I'm sorry?
There's a lot more on the poverty line.
Right, so you have many more clustered in the first and second quintile. In fact, 64% of all families who speak Spanish in the home are in the either poverty or working poor classification. And very few, 9%, would be considered in upper income classifications. European speaking, now remember, European speaking kids did what? Yeah, they scored higher. Okay, now look at their income distribution. So you find even fewer at the bottom rungs of SES and a clustering, almost 60%, at the fourth and fifth quintile. So children who come from a family that speak a European language come into this country tend to be of higher SES. And their children do fine. Very interesting. Having that language in the home doesn't seem to detract from their educational achievement. Now, if you look at Asian speaking, what do you see there? Now, remember, they started out lower, and by third grade, they were exceeding monolinguals. And what do we see there? That might help explain this. Pardon me? Well, it's not about the money in the sense of it's very evenly distributed, but they don't necessarily have those huge economic advantages of the European-speaking families, but they're not all clustered in the poor or all clustered in the high. And so the fact that they start out lower kind of makes sense because they maybe haven't had lots of advantages, but whoever it was that was talking about these cultural family supports around high achievement might actually play a role. So they speak a language other than English. They're not necessarily very, very highly resourced, and yet they do okay. Interesting. So this idea about a second language holds you back. Not necessarily. I wanted to show you this too because this explains so much. This is dividing up those groups into even further by Spanish-speaking plus means they speak Spanish in the home, but they also speak English. There's somebody in the home that speaks English, so the child's been exposed to English before they enter kindergarten. And then Spanish-speaking with a dash is these are families that we might call linguistically isolated, or they only speak Spanish in the home. Now, if you look at the Spanish-speaking plus, we have like almost about 45% of those families are in the first and second quintile, but we have, again, over 40% in the fourth and fifth quintile. So it's distributed evenly. It's not as highly clustered in the low-income categories. And if you just break out and do correlations with the SES and speak Spanish in the home and break out those children who come from middle class, not poverty-level families, speak Spanish in the home, and it's a small percentage, but those kids actually do fine. They do comparably well in English as their monolingual English-speaking peers. But Spanish-speaking with the dash, look at that figure. I mean, we weren't even expecting that. They speak only Spanish in the home. They're probably recent immigrants to the country. They're probably, a high proportion of them are from Mexico, and 80% are from very poor or working poor families, which pretty much explains that language gap. So what we concluded was that having a second language is sometimes linked to higher achievement in English, from our Eccles-K data analysis. So the fact that a child has a second language actually can be a positive. And actually, this is where I'm going to get back to the iLab stuff too, because that's where they're helping us understand why this is. So the combination of living in poverty and having limited access to early education increases the vulnerability of young dual language learners to negative outcomes. And I can't stress this enough. And the reason that I stress it is because you will be challenged on this. It's a very popular assumption that because this child speaks Spanish in the home, since that's our primary non-English language, that somehow it burdens the child. Somehow it weighs the child down. They have this one language and then they have to acquire English, and that this somehow is an impediment. No, no, and no. You need to always challenge that assumption because it just is not holding water in our data and other people's data as well. So school success for dual language learners builds on strengths. I wanted to mention this too because we found this in the Eccles-K, and Bob Krosno, actually from University of Texas at Austin, did a series of papers that were just excellent about what is it that Spanish-speaking families who have recently immigrated from Mexico, who tend to have very, very low SES, he found unusual strengths in this population that unless you knew about it, you wouldn't be looking for it, and you couldn't build upon it. But they're clearly more likely to have extended family members to help them. Families are very committed to school and have high aspirations for their children. They know language, they just don't know English. But then this unusual finding was that this group of families and children who, because they have so many risk factors of poverty, not speaking English, recently, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, you can just add it on and on and on. They still, when they were rated by their teachers, their kindergarten teachers at kindergarten entry, their social emotional skills, self-regulation, their ability to control their negative outbursts, their ability to listen to the teacher, their ability to get along with their peers exceeded the ratings of the monolingual English-speaking kids. These kids came to school with social emotional strengths. Now, if you think about that for a minute, why would you think that? I mean, why would teachers be seeing this in this population that had so many risk factors? Culture. Say it again? Culture. Okay, and what? Well, and that's where you have to sort of start looking at Hispanic, Latino parenting styles, so that there is a real emphasis on relationships, on affection, on nurturing, on caring, so that these children, when they got to kindergarten, they showed the consequences of having been in these very loving, supporting family situations. Okay, so they had, and I don't know if you all have worked with high concentrations of recent immigrants from Mexico. It is so true. It's really nice sometimes when the literature confirms, what your practice is, because, and you really do hate to stereotype and form these judgments and whatnot, but you see these things over and over and over. I ran programs in California for a long time, and I would say over 90% of our children were from recent immigrant families from Mexico, and so I worked with these children and families for a long time, and you do see this day after day after day, that these children show you this kind of social that they have developed socially, so they get along and they care about other people and they're part of this community. The sad news about this data set is that by third grade, those social advantages were gone. That they didn't exhibit any of those superior social strengths and whatnot. So, all right, so what do we know? Beliefs and attitudes matter. What we believe shapes our behavior, particularly on this topic. Again, and this is another major point. I worked in programs from Texas to Florida to lots of places in the Midwest, and one of the things that I have found is that even when programs have capacity and intentionality around supporting bilingualism or dual language, the programs almost invariably shift or migrate toward an English only or an English dominance set of practices, and they're sometimes even unaware of it. And I started to see this over and over again, and I asked teachers, we literally had been working for. Well, in one case, it was a program that was a bilingual program in a bilingual state. And when I went in and videotaped whole group, small group, and one-on-one interactions, what I found was that like 85% of all instruction was happening in English. And the Spanish, and these were teachers that were fully bilingual and bicultural. Okay, and so when I asked the teachers, why is this happening? First of all, I showed them the videotapes because nobody expected this, and they were stunned. They didn't know that's what they were doing. They were unconsciously moving into English. And especially that January to May time before kindergarten, it was like everything shifted into English. And then when I would ask them about it, finally, and again, this took some time just for people to uncover their own operating systems, but then the teacher said, well, they have to know the English. That's what they're going to be tested on in kindergarten. So that's what we have to do in the classroom. So they believed in their heart of hearts that these kids needed English to survive in this, and so I was going to do an English immersion classroom, and that was in the best interest of the children. And I say that just because when you go out into programs, if you don't have ways of carefully monitoring your behaviors, they often don't match what you say you're going to do around language. And what I found is that these deep unconscious beliefs we have about preschoolers and their capacity to learn language often governs our behavior more so than what we say, or even what we have agreed to, in the program. So inaccurate myths about dual language learning lead to impoverished learning environments for children, and that's why I gave you that myths policy thing, that I actually, the revision was due today. I'm updating it and revising it a little bit, because even since 2008, a lot of new information's come out, and clearly it's not done. But it was due today. But anyway, so I think one of the first things you have to do is uncover, what do you really think? What do you really think about babies and toddlers and preschoolers and their capacity for language learning and the benefits of one language versus another versus two, et cetera? Until you do that, you will be constrained in your ability to support dual language practices. But anyway, so having a second language is not a problem. It is not a problem. It is a gift. I say we have to believe this in our bones, or we will go into English immersion. The other thing that I try to convince, I help teachers unsurface this. No, persuade through data. Hit them over. Is that in a sense that when children come into your program, when children and families, and you don't understand their language, okay, So you are clearly a little overwhelmed, maybe a little intimidated, and our natural reaction is to pull back and do what we feel comfortable with and what we know. So if we can shift our thinking a little bit and see that child as having a gift, that child has a talent and is potentially gifted. They are bringing that talent. I don't know it. Maybe nobody else here knows it, but they are bringing that talent into my classrooms to share it with me and with the classroom. And we will all benefit from learning what that child has to offer that nobody else here has. You know, once you sort of start to see it that way, then you don't see it as they're deficient because they don't know these PPVT vocabulary words in English. And typically that's what we do. We test them in English and they don't have that language, and we see them as needing more of whatever English we can, you know, kind of pump into them. So each and every one of us has to examine, I believe, our assumptions, our beliefs, and then figure out how we can apply this in these situations with children who have multiple languages. So how can science research guide our policies and practices? And how persuasive is the research base? And I'm not going to go through all of this, but you've all seen the NAAPE, the National Early Literacy Panel. I'm not going to go into it, believe me, I'm not. But anyway, it's a really good meta-analysis of hundreds and hundreds, 7,300 studies that was condensed down into 300. But it tells us a lot about what are the preschool skills that then lead into reading comprehension. And people are doing wonderful research in this for monolinguals. Not a child in that NAAPE report was bilingual. So what that NAAPE report says about children who we're talking about is nothing. And we have to understand that because we're dealing with a different process of second language acquisition. So research for dual language learners, and I won't go into all of this, but it's a relatively new area of research because of the demographic change, because of No Child Left Behind, and we're tracking these kids separately now, so we know that they're not achieving those NAAPE scores, et cetera, everything. There's a high intensity, urgency, focus on children who start school not being proficient in English. On some studies, you know, I say dozens, you know, we're doing some comprehensive reviews of the literature for this other project that I'm involved with. Some studies, we have maybe 4 or 5, some areas, 4 or 5 studies, like language of instruction for preschoolers. We don't have a lot of studies. We don't agree with the methodology. We have very different meanings for the word dual language learners. We're using assessment instruments. So there's huge, huge variation in the quality and type of research that's being done just within education. The other thing that we still struggle with when you're working on getting funding or thinking about what does this all mean is that as a country, we have really not agreed what is our ultimate goal. We really, as a country, struggle with this. I mean, if just looking at state policies, Arizona, California, Massachusetts have English only, it's come up in Colorado again and again and again. People in this country have an idea that you can only do one language. And so policies are enacted that prohibit some of what we know will lead to high achievement for DLLs. It's unfortunate, but that's the context that we live in. So as a country, I think having that confusion and contradiction around what's in the best interest and what are our goals. Do we think everybody in this country should be bilingual? And if we think that and believe that, then we can show you how to do that beginning up, and then we're very clear. But we've never really been explicit in a consensual way around, and when I was a principal in San Francisco, after, you know, I was very young and didn't know what I was doing as usual. And one of the things that I learned, I mean, you have to have a cohesive staff that's their energy's all pointed in the same direction and that we're all contributing. One of the things that I learned is don't bring up bilingual education at the lunch table because you will get debates. I mean, there were certain topics you just avoided because people feel strongly about this. About certain topics, just it comes out, you know. And so we needed a much more controlled environment to talk about it. But anyway, the good news is, and Gina and I were talking about this today, both from the neuroscience point of view, from the psycholinguistic point of view, from the educational studies, it's sort of if you look across our disciplines and then identify what's common across, we're reaching similar conclusions. So even though we maybe only have 5 studies on language of instruction, and maybe we have a couple studies around instructional, whatever, everything's kind of, we add it to all of the other research based on what we know about language and what we know about development. And that's why I can stand here and say, I know how to do this. I mean, that I think we have enough good evidence to design strategies that are consistent with that. So here's where we get the infant brains and bilingualism, the study methods. And this, for a long time, actually, I have wanted to go to the Institute for Language and Brain Sciences, the lab here at the University of Washington. And all of the people there, Patricia Cole and Gina and their colleagues that are here this evening, have been my heroes. I mean, I just have drawn upon their work and just been so thrilled to see what they're coming out with and add it to what those of us that are more educationally oriented. So here's the way I explain it. And you guys, if you want to contradict me, go ahead. I'm fine with that. But the way I explain it is, okay, so the baby on the left, that's the old method, the EEG method, where you put the cap on and then you measure the electrical outputs and whatnot. And it was fine and it was good, but it wasn't that precise. And it couldn't necessarily tell you where things were happening in the brain, where this activity was going on. The thing on the picture on the right is Emma, right? And she's what, 6 or 7 months old? You guys, and what was your name again? Lindsay, okay. And Lindsay, I think is actually going to be on the video that I'm going to show you. So, so Emma, and she's in this machine. It's called the magnetoencephalography machine, and it's what they've been pioneering. I think the University of Washington, you guys were the first ones in the country, and it's what, $7-8 million? You got it, what, about a year ago or something like that? But anyway, so it's very recent technological improvement to be able to tell what is happening neurologically, internally, as babies are exposed to different things. And Patricia Cole and I love this. She calls it the hairdryer from Mars. So we've gone from the little cap to the hairdryer from Mars. And so what I want you to do on this video is to look for any major findings, anything surprising, and what you might see as educational implications of what they're finding. It was a TED lecture.
I want you to take a look at this baby. What you're drawn to are her eyes and the skin you love to touch. But today I'm going to talk to you about something you can't see. What's going on up in that little brain of hers? The modern tools of neuroscience are demonstrating to us that what's going on up there is nothing short of rocket science. And what we're learning is going to shed some light on what the Romantic writers and poets described as the celestial openness of the child's mind. What we see here is a mother in India, and she's speaking Koro, which is a newly discovered language. And she's talking to her baby. What this mother and the 800 people who speak Koro in the world understand that to preserve this language, they need to speak it to the babies. And therein lies a critical puzzle. Why is it that you can't preserve a language by speaking to you and I, to the adults? Well, it's got to do with your brain. What we see here is that language has a critical period for learning. The way to read this slide is to look at your age on the horizontal axis. You've done that. And you'll see on the vertical your skill at acquiring a second language. The babies and children are geniuses until they turn 7, and then there's a systematic decline. After puberty, we fall off the map. No scientists dispute this curve, but laboratories all over the world are trying to figure out why it works this way. Work in my lab is focused on the first critical period in development, and that is the period in which babies try to master which sounds are used in their language. We think by studying how the sounds are learned, we'll have a model for the rest of language, and perhaps for critical periods that may exist in childhood for social, emotional, and cognitive development. So we've been studying the babies using a technique that we're using all over the world in the sounds of all languages. The baby sits on a parent's lap, and we train them to turn their heads when a sound changes, like from ah to e. If they do so at the appropriate time, the black box lights up and a panda bear pounds a drum. A 6-monther adores the task. What have we learned? Well, babies all over the world are what I like to describe as citizens of the world. They can discriminate all the sounds of all languages, no matter what country we're testing and what language we're using. And that's remarkable because you and I can't do that. We're culture-bound listeners. We can discriminate the sounds of our own language, but not those of foreign languages. So the question arises, when do those citizens of the world turn into the language-bound listeners that we are? And the answer? Before their first birthdays. What you see here is performance on that head turn task for babies tested in Tokyo and in the United States, here in Seattle, as they listen to ra and la, sounds important to English but not to Japanese. So at 6 to 8 months, the babies are totally equivalent. 2 months later, something incredible occurs. The babies in the United States are getting a lot better. The babies in Japan are getting a lot worse, but both of those groups of babies are preparing for exactly the language that they're going to learn. So the question is, what's happening during this critical 2-month period? This is the critical period for sound development, but what's going on up there? So there are 2 things going on. The first is that the babies are listening intently to us, and they're taking statistics as they listen to us talk. They're taking statistics. So listen to 2 mothers speaking motherese, the universal language we use when we talk to kids, first in English and then in Japanese.
I love your big blue eyes. So pretty and nice.
うわー、大きな茶色いお目目。そして綺麗な黒い髪。
During the production of speech, when babies listen, what they're doing is taking statistics on the language that they hear. And those distributions grow. And what we've learned is that babies are sensitive to the statistics, and the statistics of Japanese and English are very, very different. English has a lot of R's and L's, the distribution shows, and the distribution of Japanese is totally different, where we see a group of intermediate sounds, which is known as the Japanese R. So babies absorb the statistics of the language, and it changes their brains. It changes them from the citizens of the world to the culture-bound listeners that we are. But we as adults are no longer absorbing those statistics. We're governed by the representations in memory that were formed early in development. So what we're seeing here is changing our models of what the critical period is about. We're arguing from a mathematical standpoint that the learning of language material may slow down when our distributions stabilize. It's raising lots of questions about bilingual people. Bilinguals must keep 2 sets of statistics in mind at once and flip between them, one after the other, depending on who they're speaking to. So we asked ourselves, can the babies take statistics on a brand new language? And we tested this by exposing American babies who'd never heard a second language to Mandarin for the first time during the critical period. We knew that when monolinguals were tested in Taipei and Seattle on the Mandarin sounds, they showed the same pattern. 6 to 8 months, they're totally equivalent. 2 months later, something incredible happens. But the Taiwanese babies are getting better, not the American babies. What we did was expose American babies during this period to Mandarin. It was like having Mandarin relatives come and visit for a month and move into your house and talk to the babies for 12 sessions. Here's what it looked like in the laboratory.
发生了什么事情哦？小小熊七七在这里，一个绿色的圈圈，绿色的圈圈。 绿色的圈圈，再转一下，转一圈，嘿，一圈，再一次哦，转1、2、3。
So what have we done to their little brains? We had to run a control group to make sure that just coming into the laboratory didn't improve your Mandarin skills. So a group of babies came in and listened to English, and we can see from the graph that exposure to English didn't improve their Mandarin. But look what happened to the babies exposed to Mandarin for 12 sessions. They were as good as the babies in Taiwan who'd been listening for 10.5 months. What it demonstrated is that babies take statistics on a new language. Whatever you put in front of them, they'll take statistics on. But we wondered what role the human being played in this learning exercise. So we ran another group of babies in which the kids were get the same dosage, the same 12 sessions, but over a television set. And another group of babies who had just audio exposure and looked at a teddy bear on the screen. What did we do to their brains? What you see here is the audio result, no learning whatsoever, and the video result, no learning whatsoever. It takes a human being for babies to take their statistics. The social brain is controlling when the babies are taking their statistics. We want to get inside the brain and see this thing happening as babies are in front of televisions as opposed to in front of human beings. Thankfully, we have a new machine, magnetoencephalography, that allows us to do this. It looks like a hairdryer from Mars, but it's completely safe, completely non-invasive, and silent. We're looking at millimeter accuracy with regard to spatial and millisecond accuracy using 306 squids. These are superconducting quantum interference devices to pick up the magnetic fields that change as we do our thinking. We're the first in the world to record babies in an MEG machine while they are learning. So this is little Emma. She's a 6-monther, and she's listening to various languages in the earphones that are in her ears. You can see she can move around. We're tracking her head with little pellets in a cap, so she's free to move, completely unconstrained. It's a technical tour de force. What are we seeing? We're seeing the baby brain as the baby hears a word in her language. The auditory areas light up, and then subsequently areas surrounding it that we think are related to coherence, getting the brain coordinated with its different areas, and causality, one brain area causing another to activate. We are embarking on a grand and golden age of knowledge about the child's brain development. We're going to be able to see a child's brain as they experience an emotion, as they learn to speak and read, as they solve a math problem, as they have an idea. And we're going to be able to invent brain-based interventions for children who have difficulty learning. Just as the poets and writers described, we're going to be able to see, I think, that wondrous openness, utter and complete openness of the mind of a child. In investigating the child's brain, we're going to uncover deep truths about what it means to be human. And in the process, we may be able to help keep our own minds open to learning for our entire lives. Thank you.
So, and that might have even been taped in this room. I don't know, but it was here at the University of Washington at one of the TED Talks. So as you watched that, what struck you? What was significant about what they're finding out at the iLabs? Anything surprising?
I thought it was surprising that you can only achieve language learning through another human being versus TV or radio, because that is used a lot of times when you're learning language at an older level.
Right, that there seems to be something about language learning during those first couple of years of life that does require some sort of contingent interaction responsiveness that screen time just isn't providing. Yeah, and you know, interestingly enough, those of us that have been in the field for a while, we actually have talked long and hard about the need for responsive interactions as the mechanism for learning. And now neuroscience is confirming this neurologically, that that's how language learning happens. So to some extent, we've been seeing things behaviorally and maybe haven't gotten quite the scientific leverage, but now the neuroscientists are actually confirming it. So so that's where I see a lot of things are converging here. Anything else that you saw?
I was really surprised by the window of time between 8 months to 10 months, and it's kind of like completely different brain between before 8 months to after 10 months. So it's kind of like very small. They still can learn pretty good at the age of 3 to 7, but the sound system kind of the acquisition of it when they're babies.
Isn't that amazing? That first, and these kids have not spoken a word, and and they are rapidly, actively acquiring and processing the sound systems of any language that they're exposed to. To me, that was a very significant breakthrough as well, because it tells you babies have the capacity to listen to and understand multiple languages. The other thing that I think, the fact that it declines so rapidly with age, so that how as adults, the way we see second language learning is often through the lens of when we were adolescents trying to learn a foreign language in school. And it was very, very difficult. And typically, most of us didn't succeed very well at it because, again, this helps us explain when the brain is hardwired to absorb those features of a language in a fairly natural way, if you will. As adolescents, we've already lost some of that capacity. So when we look, I actually think it helps explain also why we have these adult beliefs about second language learning. Is because we're looking at it through our own experiences. We don't have the memories of being 1 or 2 or 3.
I think that also reading has something to do with it, because once you read, you have a structure in your mind, or everything like grammatically, like you have expectations of what you're supposed to do, and before you read, it's like two different worlds that you're not trying to compare anything, it's just like one and the other. So.
Well, that's a very interesting observation, that after 7, you have some reading capacity, so you can match the orthography to the sounds, to the words, to the meaning, et cetera, and that might shift your brain. Very interesting hypothesis, you guys. Here's an iLab study, I can tell, But that's an interesting observation around what happens about 7 years of age. Yeah, interesting. Uh-huh.
I'd like to add that the high school environment for learning languages is aversive. Other kids in the classroom are making fun of you. The teacher spends very little time with each student. The material is unfamiliar. It's just a harsh place to be. And I'm remembering that from
What high school did you go to? No. I don't remember high school language classes being that punitive and harsh, but I do remember them being largely unsuccessful. That it's just difficult to learn in that context in a school setting. But I think, again, we need to reframe kind of how we think about exposure to languages and timing. Because if we always see it as difficult, arduous, and likely frustrating and not successful, then we're going to see this exposure to multiple languages for little children in a very different way. I actually think about it when I was kind of reviewing, a lot of my notes and thinking about it. It reminded me of when you guys, especially you guys who are undergraduates, you take your first child development courses, you take Piaget, you take Vygotsky, and you learn that young children are not miniature adults. They think in qualitatively different ways. And that was a huge breakthrough for me to really realize they're not logically impaired. They're really truly thinking in different ways. They form associations and make conclusions in very common sense ways, but it's different than an adult. Okay, and that's the way I think about young children, is the way they learn language is qualitatively different than the way adults learn language. So what we know, and even what we know about K-12 education, doesn't really necessarily apply to how we would structure an early childhood environment, because this is a different stage of their language development process. So we have to sort of shift it around a little bit. I see it as a major phenomenological breakthrough that I will write up shortly. But no, and you know what? I'm going to skip a whole bunch to go to. Because I don't want you to leave here without thinking about the practical applications of this. How does this all come together in terms of your early childhood classrooms? So the first thing is dual language children are different from monolingual children. Their brains look different, their process of language acquisition, but we need to know when they were exposed to which language, so are they simultaneous or successive, and we can only find that out by working with the families. We also know that second language acquisition is uneven. That depending upon what's happening in the home, how much English exposure, they're going to go up and down in their first language and their second language, which has huge implications for assessment. And so from the brain research and other, my conclusion from that is we need to know about both languages. We cannot just, and I don't know what Washington State does in their Race to the Top, if their kindergarten entry includes their home language or not. But to be fair to these children and to understand their development, you really have to have some information about home language. And then I want to show you talk for just a minute about stages of second language acquisition. Typically, children, and I'm talking about preschool age children, will go through a kind of a predictable stage or waves or whatnot as they're acquiring the second language. So the first one will continue to use their home language. Even nobody understands it, doesn't matter, they chatter away. Then they figure out this language doesn't work for these purposes because it's all about meaning and interacting. So they go, a lot of times you'll see kids start to withdraw, draw back, and go into this sort of non-productive stage where they're observing and watching, which is fine. That's a very active language learning stage during the preschool years. Not a problem with it. But during that period, you don't want to assess these kids because they're probably not going to have much English vocabulary in a productive way, and they might even show some declines in their home language. That's a normal stage. Then there's the stage telegraphic or formulaic speech where kids start to reproduce sounds without knowing necessarily what they mean. They'll string together because they've heard sounds. Come over here, what do you think? What's up? Go, what, you know, they're stringing together sounds that they have heard other children use to achieve a particular effect in a classroom. And if you've ever gone to a country where you didn't speak the language, you know, it can be a very effective. It's what Lily Wong Fillmore talks about, fake it till you make it. You start to sound like, you know, when I went to France, actually I was looking at the École Maternelle, and I don't speak French. Actually, my French teacher said I spoke French with a Spanish accent, which is interesting because that wasn't my first language. But anyway, and so there's this phrase in French déco, is that right? For French speakers? Anyway, it means that's right. Okay, sure, okay, fine, that everything's okay. De accord, I think, is what it really means, but that's in accordance with what I thought or whatever. But you can use that term in just about any conversation. And people think you know French, and so they start, you know, rattling off. But anyway, that's kind of what children start to do because they are compelled to be a part of a group, to have these social connections and then productive language. If you're speaking in a language even highly motivated children don't understand, you're going to find all kinds of very strange behavior, and it has nothing to do with their capacity or their knowledge. The other thing that I like to take away from this, if you have never been in a setting where you don't know the language, you are the language minority person, do it. Go to a church, go to a whatever, some sort of cultural event where you're totally out, the odd one out in terms of language, because it gives you some emotional appreciation for what it's like for young children to enter into those settings, and so you might see those behaviors. But the point is, there are ways that you can bring in the home language as the child's going through that stage, that phase of primarily speaking in their home language. And the classrooms were primarily in English. What we found in studies that oftentimes what teachers do is pull back and stop talking to children when it's clear the child doesn't understand the language. This child the teacher kind of modeled a parallel talk, you know, where the child is still having language exposure and social interaction. Again, it's a hard thing to do instinctively because that kind of goes against our nature to go to the child that's responding to us, but we need to kind of train ourselves that at that stage, it's really important for the child to have language input, language interaction, and to be a part of the group. So even though I don't have a chance to go into all of the various strategies that we've put together, one of the really critical things you can do is set up the environment and anticipate, plan for, prepare for these sorts of child-led language learning opportunities. And I actually have gone over my time by 10 minutes, and I promised my people that I would not talk the whole time, and I'm going to hold to that. So I really want to give you all a chance to ask me some questions, anything about anything I didn't touch, confusing, anything around dual language development.
I just wanted to comment on that last clip that you showed. The thing that struck out most to me was that beautiful peer teaching in English could not have happened had their first language not been so rich. When I heard them speaking Spanish, I heard so many more verbs. I heard a conversation. I heard much freer language than the routine language in English. But that English could not have happened without that solid social communication and that solid L1 foundation. And that is just so beautifully emphasized by them. And that's really just jumped out to me. That is so great.
And they're clearly dominant in Spanish. That is their first most comfortable language. But look at how much intellectual energy they were expending on trying to apply this to this new language that was the language. So you can see kids are compelled to learn English. That's not going to be our problem. Our problem is going to be to activate what they do know in their L1, and the more they have command of that language, the easier it's going to be for them then to transfer that and apply this to a difficult task. Clearly, I mean, the timing's good, but it's still it's a cognitive high demand level to learn this second language. So yeah, I mean, we were privileged to have the benefit of some really excellent videographer, and he just knew what to capture in the classroom, because those moments are so precious to have that on tape. So other things, other comments, questions,
I just having the girls who spoke Chinese who were teaching the teacher. I mean, that was beautiful in so many ways, but what really got me was the confidence that inspires in them, and seeing the value of their own of their first language. And my second grade daughter's in a language immersion program. Her first language is in English, and about half the kids in her school are Spanish first language speakers, and they're gaining such a bigger sense of value in their first language, and I just love it. It's fantastic to see, and I just think that's a huge part of the importance of the dual language, is maintaining that confidence and value in your home language.
You know, the other thing that it showed me, and I totally agree, and that teacher had obviously worked very hard to communicate to the children that this is good for you to use that language to show me. You know, so that was not something that the children were shying away from. But the other thing that little clip shows me, you could not find more joyful language learning interaction. I mean, we talk about how, you know, early childhood has become pretty heavy-handed. You know that they need to learn the alphabet, they need to learn phonological awareness, they need to learn how to say da. These are skills, and people sometimes have translated those into a very directive, teacher-controlled set of instructional strategies. You don't have to do that. You can maintain the integrity of joyful, playful learning and still accomplish these high-level language accomplishment goals when you set things up correctly. Because I think you know, just to see those girls giggle and laugh and show off and kind of, you know, think that they're a little superior to this, because he clearly doesn't know how to say, zoo, you know, just to see that happen.
Yeah. I mean, she feels she's the expert.
Right.
You know? And she will always be better than me in Spanish, always. And I mean, what a cool thing.
Absolutely. Well, you'll pay for it when she becomes a teenager. No. No, don't get me started. No. But, okay. No, it'll be fine. It'll be fine. You'll live through it. It'll be good. What were you going to say?
Hi.
I'm sorry. Where are we?
I guess me, because I have the microphone, right?
Oh, I'm sorry.
First of all, thank you very much. It was a lot of really cool information. My question would be about code switching, about using one language and another, mixing, et cetera, et cetera. How is that working for kids? What about the adults, meaning the teachers, the parents who are trying to promote and foster the language development in both languages?
Right, and that's been of concern. Probably about 7-8 years ago, I was working throughout the state of New Jersey, and the directors came to me and said, you've got to stop these kids from speaking Spanglish. I said, what's Spanglish? And then they would take me in, and it was basically code switching. Children were substituting Spanish words, typically for words they didn't know in English, in one utterance. You know, I want más algo, whatever, something like that. So they were inserting Spanish words into a communicative interaction. And people have been concerned about that. In fact, what we know, okay, and you all need to take this home with you, is that, first of all, it's a natural process of second language acquisition, and it happens for multiple reasons. For little children, a lot of it's because they don't know that particular word, or there is no literal translation or something like that. Doesn't matter. It's a natural process of language development that is no concern, absolutely no concern. The latest little twist on that is that preschool-age children who do more code switching, who dip into their Spanish linguistic resources to contribute to their English communicative efforts, they actually, children at the preschool who do more of that turn out in later years to be more proficient in both languages. So it's a strength. Again, it's a linguistic strength. It's not because they're deficient in English. It's normal. Now, for adults, that doesn't mean adults should code switch. Okay, that doesn't mean, it's just like when children make grammatical mistakes in their past tense and whatnot. We understand that. We don't get too distressed about it. We just provide a good language model. And at this point in time, and I always think maybe 5 years we'll think differently about that, but what we are recommending is that when you're doing an activity or reading a book or having a language interaction, you keep it coherent in a language so that it is a good model of that language, whatever language you happen to be using, and you as an adult do not code switch. And you do not engage in simultaneous translation either, because that just kind of, it may ultimately prove not to be a distraction, but at this point, what we are recommending is that when you have, a unit of interaction, a language interaction, you keep it clear and concise and in one language so it can be coherent. And that's how the child starts to put that together into making meaning in this. These are the rules, these are the vocabulary, this is how this language works, and this is how this. I talk about in terms of bracketing each language. Like when we put up print, we color code it. We create distinctions between each of those languages. It may eventually prove unnecessary because kids may actually not get confused over any of this. It just helps to make it more explicit. Just like lots of stuff with little kids, you make it very explicit. You're going to go before, and then you model what that looks like, so they can connect that word with that action with that intention. And so I like to signify whichever language you're working in, in Espanol, whatever. And then you do the Spanish, and then you have the Spanish print, and you can point to that, that sort of thing. At this point, I would not recommend mixing them as an adult. But do not be concerned when you see your kids doing it. Okay, what I recommend is that when you're doing, let's say you're doing book reading, and it's got the you've picked the vocabulary, it's in the book, you're book reading to the whole group. What I recommend is that you do this sort of cognate comparison, if you will. We have teachers actually go in and look for the cognates in the books and then compare the words, both the key vocabulary words in both languages, again, color-coded, put them on a chart. Here's what they look like in your home language, here's what they look like in English, and then you start to help that child. It's part of what we call bridging, explicit bridging from what the child knows. They know this word in this language. You activate that, and then you help them apply it to this new language, English. And we do it through pictures, through print, through oral reinforcements, etc. Pardon me? That requires finding those words first. It requires preparation. So you have to prepare around those key vocabulary words. And if you can do that with the help, if you don't speak that language, you have to do that with the help of somebody. If it's a parent, great. If it's a community rep, great. If it's somebody that helps you identify that particular vocabulary and the correct pronunciation, and then attach it to the new vocabulary that you're focused on, the conceptual vocabulary that's going to help them understand that story, that activity, that intentional, educational objective. But we have to do that, okay? If you're really lucky and you have a paraprofessional or you have a parent or you have somebody, reading the book in the home language first is the ideal thing. And if you can get a parent to come in and print out what the words are in that language and have that available, or even tape it into, talk it into a tape recorder and you have that available, that's ideal. But the main point is we have to, like remember that little Sun Woo who turned around? She's doing the shark thing. It's not a bad lesson if you know English. He didn't know English. So somehow we have to help that child understand what that story is about. And we do that by helping him connect to what is it he understands about sharks in his own language or whatever, you know. So yeah, it does take. Okay.
Okay, I'm teaching Spanish in one Montessori school here in Washington. I choose to read the same book with the aid of the teacher, in the two languages at the same time. Then we read a one page and one page. And the children, when I ask the children at the end what this word means, I pronounce the word in Spanish, actually they really give me the right answer.
Right. And what age are the children?
Pre-K.
Pre-K? I actually would not, I applaud you for reading it in both languages because you have that capacity and these kids are going to benefit from that. So that is wonderful. What I would do is read it straight through in Spanish and activate their vocabulary knowledge, their, you know, what narrative sequence, etc. Activate that in Spanish, get that all kind of going and get them talking about it. Then at a later point, I would read it in English again and try to connect back to what you had read to them in Spanish. I would not flip back and forth between the languages during one book reading. I just wouldn't do that.
Okay.
Quite frankly, you know, so.
I'm a children's librarian in the public library, and what I'm seeing is a growing number of children who speak way more than 2 languages. My record is a child who speaks 8 fluently. And what I'm wondering is about the brain development. If a child grows up with, or starts with 2 languages, and they're having those stronger connections in the brain, then even when they're older, are they being able to learn 3rd and 4th and 5th languages more fluently, even though they're out of that zone because they have the stronger brain connections?
There does seem to be some data which suggests that when you learn multiple languages, it does prepare your brain for adding additional, you know, sound and you know, features of other languages. So it does help you to become a better language learner in general. Exactly what the outer limits are. I had a student once, and she had been a Peace Corps volunteer in Africa, and she said that young children in this village knew actually 17 dialects because people would come in from different tribes, and you would respond to them differently depending upon the way they dressed. And she said, and the kids had no problem, you know, understanding which dialect was appropriate for which communication to be effective and whatnot. So what the upper limit is and how to support that, whether that's good, whether that in any way dampens down the strength in one language. You know, a lot of this stuff is still, I think, to be discovered. But yeah, there is some data that suggests that multiple language exposure early on does prepare the brain to add, and it makes you just a better, you know, that whole language aptitude thing. It does seem to be beneficial in that regard, yeah. I mean, you know, when I just look at the data and I look at our kids and I see what's kind of going on there, I think that when you are exposed, just like we saw Eduardo reading, we saw those little girls, the demand is high, but the motivation is very high as well. And what we found in our bilingual studies in California was something triggers cognitively when these kids start learning 2 languages that exceeds what we expected in either this one or that one. Something is going on there that I think is spiraling for these children that helps them understand basic features of language and promotes, what we found even was conceptual development was promoted. So exactly what that is, how that happens, and what the best language exposure models are. I mean, a lot of that we're still discovering, but I just believe the more the better. And if anybody asks, 2 is definitely better than 1. And especially as you get older, because you lose capacity in 1. Do we have, okay, I think we have time for one more. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, so has there been any work that involves the families of these children? And if so, what would the recommendations be, besides obviously exposing the children to as many languages as the family is proficient in? For example, should one parent speak one language only and the other parents the other language, or what would the recommendation be for the families?
Right, and that used to be kind of the recommendation. If you wanted your child to grow up in a bilingual household, mom would speak Spanish, dad would speak English, or whatever. When they really looked at that deeply, it never happened. People don't stick to one language if they have a bilingual capacity. What I tell my parents, when I was working in California in our Spanish dominant settings, I had parents that actually were concerned about speaking Spanish in the home because they felt that that slowed down their English development. And again, this is what, no, not true, couldn't be more untrue. But this was 15 years ago, and so our recommendations were kind of lukewarm. Now, I think we absolutely know the family is critical in maintaining that home language development and progress. Schools tend to migrate to English. They get into English peer groups, into English social situations. That seems to be driving them externally. If families, and I think everyone should promote bilingualism, can support home language development, they need to be very firm about that. We speak Spanish in our home, and then hold to it. Kids will try to drive you away from that. 3-year-olds will try to speak to you only in English. Because remember, we saw it, they pick it up very quickly. So you have to, again, it's just like teachers. We have to believe in our bones this is going to help the child and will not in any way impede their English achievement for, again, those kindergarten entry scores. Everybody's just fixated on what they look like at kindergarten. This is not in any way going to detract. I mean, that is one thing we know about bilingual preschool, is that those kids are just as good in English as kids who have been in monolingual programs, but their native language abilities exceed those that have been in these monolingual English classrooms. So we know that bilingualism helps kids and does not slow them down in English in any way. And long term, it's really what's going to help maintain all of these cognitive advantages, all of these linguistic talents, so that when we look at them in 3rd and 4th grade, and they have a balanced bilingualism, that's what the educational literature is telling us, that those are the kids that are most likely to achieve at grade level, not the ones that go into the English immersion early. And I say it's kind of like cutting kids off at the knees. They know this language, they've processed the world, they understand the world this way, and then we put them into an English immersion preschool. Even though they look like they acquire English very rapidly and at low cost, actually what you're doing is undercutting what they've been progressing in, the ways in which they have learned language up to that point. And those seem to be the children that struggle the most as they progress in school, because they never develop linguistic capacity in English, and their home language clearly is not developed. So it's a complicated topic, and I'm sorry that I ran out of time, because I actually had 4 more videotapes to show you, but and 38 more slides. But hey, we'll save that for another time. No, but I want to thank you so much. And I've gone over my time. It's been wonderful. Thank you. I hope it was helpful. Thank you.